The morning I found out I was making coffee. That detail has always stayed with me, the specific ordinariness of standing at the kitchen counter measuring grounds into a filter while my phone was face up on the counter showing me a message that had been sent to the wrong number. It was meant for her sister. It was a long message, the kind people write when they are certain they are writing in private, and it contained details that I will not repeat here because some things do not need to be said in full to be understood completely. I read it twice. I set my phone face down. I finished making the coffee. I poured 1 cup. I sat at the table where my wife and I had eaten breakfast together for 11 years, and I drank the coffee slowly, and I thought about what I was going to do. Not what I was going to say, not how I was going to confront, what I was going to do. Because the man I had become over 47 years of living had learned the hard way that the distance between reacting and responding is the distance between losing and winning, and I was not going to lose. Not after 11 years, not after everything I had built and given and trusted. I finished the coffee, I washed the cup, I put it back in the cabinet. I went to my office, I closed the door, I called my attorney. My name is Nathan Osei. I am 51 years old. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, the son of a Ghanaian father who came to the United States in 1971 with an engineering degree and a determination that I absorbed before I was old enough to understand what determination meant. I grew up watching my father solve problems with patience and precision and the specific refusal to allow emotion to substitute for strategy. I carried those lessons into a career in commercial real estate development that I built over 23 years from a single property acquisition into a portfolio that generated, by the time of the morning with the coffee, approximately $4.2 million in annual income across 12 properties in 3 states. I had built it methodically and without shortcuts and with the same patience my father had modeled. I had also, 11 years earlier, married a woman named Diane who was beautiful and intelligent and whom I had loved with the completeness that a man loves when he believes completely in what he has chosen. I had given her everything I was capable of giving. I had assumed she was doing the same. The message on my phone told me the assumption had been wrong for considerably longer than one morning. Diane and I met at a charity gala in Atlanta in 2012. She was 32 and working in event management and had the specific quality of presence that makes a room feel organized around her, which I had found attractive in a way that went beyond the surface because I valued competence and she was competent. We dated for 2 years, married in 2014, and built a life in a house in Buckhead that I had purchased and renovated, and that Diane had furnished with the eye for detail that her professional background produced. The 11 years had been good years in the way that years are good when both people are investing in the same direction and when the investment is producing returns that feel worth the cost. We had no children, a decision we had reached together and revisited together and maintained together. We had a lifestyle that was comfortable and full and that I was proud of in the specific way that a man who has built something from nothing is proud of what the building has produced. I had trusted Diane completely. I had given her access to the household accounts and to my professional calendar and to the social and professional relationships I had built over 23 years because trust was not, in my understanding, a managed allocation. It was a given, I gave it, and I expected it in return. The message on the phone was the information that the expectation had not been accurate for a period that the subsequent investigation would clarify as approximately 3 years. His name was Joseph. He was 29 years old. His mother had worked as our housekeeper for 6 years, a woman named Gloria who had been reliable and discreet, and who I had always treated with the respect that I extend to anyone who performs their work with professionalism. Gloria had retired 2 years earlier for health reasons, and I had provided her with a severance that reflected 6 years of good service. Joseph had visited the house on several occasions when his mother was working. He was, by the accounts I later assembled through means I will describe, a young man of charm and physical presence and the specific quality of attentiveness that some people deploy not as genuine interest but as a practiced tool. He worked in fitness instruction. He had social media accounts that documented a lifestyle that was substantially more expensive than fitness instruction accounts for. The investigation I commissioned through a private firm in the weeks after the coffee morning produced a picture that was specific and documented, and that I will not detail further than to say it confirmed what the message had told me and established a timeline that was longer than I had hoped and shorter than I had feared. 3 years, the investigation produced 3 years of a parallel life that my wife had been maintaining alongside the life we shared, and that had been funded, in part, through the household accounts I had given her access to because I trusted her completely. My attorney's name was Caroline Asant, and she had handled my business legal matters for 14 years and had the quality of a person who processes difficult information without reacting to it, which was the quality I most needed in the weeks after the coffee morning. I sat across from her and I laid out everything: the message, the investigation, the timeline, the household account withdrawals that the investigation had traced to expenses I had not been informed of. Caroline listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Nathan, I want to ask you one question before we discuss next steps. What outcome do you want?" I said, "I want every asset I have built to be accurately documented and protected. I want the divorce to reflect the actual history of this marriage and not the version that benefits someone who used my trust against me, and I want to come out of this in a position from which I can continue building." She said, "Those are achievable outcomes. Let's build toward them." We spent 3 hours that afternoon. By the end of the 3 hours, Caroline had a clear picture of every asset, every account, every property, and the documentation that established what I had brought into the marriage and what had been generated during it, and the specific financial conduct that the investigation had uncovered. She said, "Nathan, I want a forensic accountant on this by end of week." I said, "Already done?" The forensic accountant's name was Margaret Osei, no relation, and she had spent 20 years in financial forensics and had the specific combination of methodical patience and professional anger that people in that field develop when they spend 2 decades finding money that has been moved in ways it should not have been moved. She reviewed 3 years of household and personal accounts. The findings were specific and documented, and I will summarize them in the terms that matter. Over 38 months, a total of $214,000 had been withdrawn or transferred from accounts I controlled through mechanisms that had been deliberately structured to avoid the threshold amounts that generate automatic review flags. The withdrawals were consistent in their pattern, which is to say they were the work of someone who had thought about what they were doing and had done it carefully over a long period rather than impulsively in a short one. The money had funded things that Margaret described as a secondary lifestyle maintained at a level inconsistent with any legitimate expense category I had authorized. I sat with Margaret's report for an evening. Then I called Caroline and told her we had everything we needed. I filed first. That detail matters in the specific way that certain procedural details matter in legal proceedings, because the person who files establishes the initial framing of the case, and because I had spent 6 weeks preparing to file with the thoroughness that the situation warranted and that my attorney had directed. Diane received the filing on a Thursday morning through her attorney. The filing was accompanied by Caroline's formal discovery requests and the forensic accountant's preliminary findings presented as an exhibit. Diane's attorney called Caroline that afternoon. The call was brief because Caroline had anticipated every element of what Diane's attorney was going to say and had prepared responses that were specific and documented, and that made the path toward a contested proceeding look considerably more costly than the path toward a negotiated resolution. Diane and I had been married for 11 years. Georgia is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are distributed equitably rather than equally, and equitable takes into account specific factors including the conduct of the parties during the marriage. The forensic accountant's report was relevant to the conduct analysis. Diane's attorney understood this clearly after the first exchange of documents. Diane asked to meet with me directly, without attorneys, before the mediation that Caroline had proposed as the resolution mechanism. I agreed because Caroline advised that direct engagement, managed carefully, sometimes produces more honest conversations than proceedings where every word is filtered through counsel. We met at a restaurant I chose because it was neutral and because I had never been there with Diane and because the absence of shared history in the location suited the nature of the conversation. She came in with the specific quality of a person who has been preparing for a difficult conversation and who has rehearsed several versions of it and is not certain which version the other person is going to require. I was quieter than she expected. She had prepared, I think, for anger or accusation, and I gave her neither because anger was not what I was feeling, and accusation was not necessary given that the documentation had already established the facts. I asked her one question. I said, "How long did you know that what you were doing was going to cost us everything?" She looked at the table. She said, "I told myself it wasn't going to get this far." I said, "Everything gets as far as you take it." We sat with that for a while. Then I told her what the mediation was going to produce and what the alternative to mediation looked like, and I told her clearly and without dramatizing it that my preference was the efficient resolution and that her preference was her own decision. She said she would agree to mediation. She said she was sorry. I told her the apology was heard. I did not tell her what I was going to do with it, because what I was going to do with it was put it in the same folder where I kept all the things that were true and not useful and move forward. The mediation lasted 2 sessions over 3 weeks. Caroline managed it with the precision she brought to everything, and the settlement that emerged reflected the actual history of the marriage rather than the simplified version that a standard equitable distribution would have produced without the forensic accountant's findings. The marital home, which I had purchased and renovated before the marriage and which had appreciated significantly during it, was addressed with documentation of its premarital origin that established my contribution clearly. The $214,000 that Margaret's forensic accounting had traced was addressed as a specific item in the settlement with a corresponding offset. The investment properties I had developed during the marriage, built on capital that I had generated through the professional work that had been my primary activity throughout, were addressed with valuations that reflected their actual worth and provisions that protected my ability to continue managing them as the operating entity I had built. When the settlement documents were signed, I was in a position that was, financially, close to the position I had been in before the marriage, not because the marriage had produced nothing, but because the documentation had established clearly what was mine and what was shared, and what the conduct of the other party had cost in specific and calculable terms. Caroline said when we reviewed the final documents, "Nathan, you prepared for this better than most people prepare for anything." I said, "I had a good teacher." She asked who. I said, "My father." I want to address Joseph specifically because people always ask and because the answer is instructive in a way that is relevant to the story. Nothing happened to Joseph that I caused. Joseph was a 29-year-old man who had been involved with a married woman and who was not a party to my divorce proceeding and who had no professional or financial connection to me that required addressing. What happened to Joseph is what tends to happen in those situations when the financial arrangement that was supporting the secondary lifestyle concludes because the primary arrangement that was funding it has been dissolved. The social media accounts documenting the expensive lifestyle became quieter in the months after the settlement. I know this because I checked once and only once, and then I stopped because checking was not something I was going to spend the years of my life doing. What mattered was not what happened to Joseph. What mattered was what happened to me. What happened to me was the best 3 years of my professional life. The focus that the divorce process had required me to apply to documenting and protecting my assets had produced a comprehensive understanding of my portfolio that I had not had in the same complete and organized form before, because when things are running well, there is a tendency to manage broadly rather than specifically. The forensic accountant's work had given me a granular picture of every asset and every cash flow, and every opportunity that I had been managing too generally. I spent the year after the settlement reorganizing the portfolio with the specificity that Margaret's work had revealed was necessary, and the reorganization produced results that I want to be honest about because honesty is how this story has been told throughout. In the 2 years following the settlement, the portfolio's annual income grew from $4.2 million to $6.8 million, not because I did anything dramatically different. Because I was paying attention with the specific attention of a man who had been given, at considerable personal cost, a complete and accurate picture of what he had and what it was worth and what it needed to develop fully. The divorce was expensive. The clarity it produced was worth more than it cost. Gloria, Joseph's mother, had worked for me for 6 years with honesty and professionalism and had retired with a severance that reflected that service. I want to be clear that nothing that happened between her son and my wife was her responsibility or her fault, and that my regard for her as a person who had worked with integrity was not diminished by the actions of anyone in her family. I sent her a card at Christmas 2 years after the divorce, as I had done every year since her retirement. She sent one back. The card said she hoped I was well. I wrote back that I was well and that I hoped the same for her. That exchange was the entirety of our contact on the matter. It is also, I think, the right way to handle the distinction between a person and the actions of the people connected to them. My name is Nathan Osei. I am 51 years old. My father came from Ghana with an engineering degree and taught me to solve problems with patience and precision and the specific refusal to allow emotion to substitute for strategy. I found a message on my phone on a morning when I was making coffee, and I finished making the coffee and I washed the cup and I called my attorney and I spent 6 weeks preparing before I filed, and I came out of a difficult situation in a position from which I could continue building. The rebuilding produced more than the original. It always does when the foundation is solid and the documentation is complete and the person doing the building has learned, at whatever cost the learning required, exactly what he is working with. My wife chose someone else, I chose myself. The choosing took longer than it should have and cost more than it needed to and produced, in the end, more clarity than I had before any of it happened. That is not a comfortable accounting. It is an honest one, and honest is the only kind worth keeping. If this story reached something and you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe if you have not already. Topics 2 and 3 are coming.